Hi, it's Writing Wednesday, and if you hear a thudding, hammering noise in the background, that is not my muse struggling to get out. That is my son and his band having band practice upstairs, which seems to involve a lot of loud, thumpy drumming. But I guess the idea of the muse is kind of relevant because this week I'm going to do the Q&A video that I was supposed to do last week for Writing Wednesday number 50. So probably the question I most commonly get asked, and did indeed get asked for this Q&A, about writing, and I think probably the most common question all writers get is, where do you get inspiration? Where do you get ideas? And for me this is kind of a hard question to answer because I think I'm almost more likely to ask, where do I not get ideas? Like, things are constantly popping into my head. One thing that I really like about myself, just to be a little bit vain and arrogant for a few minutes, but I have never really gotten into the whole jaded, cynical middle-aged thing yet. Now, it might be coming because I'm coming up on 50, but I still get really excited about ideas. And this is not just writing. This is life. This is everything. This is teaching. This is stuff in the community. This is just ideas for things I want to do for myself or with my family. I'm so capable of coming up with an idea and getting completely absorbed in it for a few hours or a few days. And quite often the end result is kind of thinking through and thinking, oh yeah, logistically this is not practical, it's not going to work at all. But, you know, some of them do, and that's great. And it's kind of the same way with writing ideas. Things are constantly popping into my head and I'm going, oh, that would be a great story idea. And then as I kind of pursue it a little more, which often doesn't even get to the point of putting anything down on paper, just thinking it through, I think, no, really not. Not a great story idea. Or maybe I just don't have enough to say about that, or it's not a direction I want to go in. But it can be just, you know, a story I heard someone tell, random fragments of something that someone said. A little while ago someone was talking about the early colony at Cupid's here in Newfoundland, and there was a reference to, I don't know, the first winter or the second winter, a boat with 12 women being sent out to provide some women, I guess, for the new colony. And that idea just snagged in my brain, a boat full of women just being shipped out to this colony on the godforsaken edge of nowhere. I've still got that idea kind of niggling at my brain. I don't know, once I start doing some research about Cupids, whether it's something I'm going to want to run with for a story, but just a boat with 12 women on it. That was enough to get me thinking, there's a potential story there. So I guess I'm constantly tuned for story ideas, listening to people, listening to things, and hearing something that makes me go, ooh, is there a story in that? Now, another question that I've gotten before, and that I did indeed get this time, is not just how do you get inspired initially, but how do you stay inspired? In other words, when you've started on a project, you're into it, and particularly maybe when it's not going so well, what is it that keeps you going and inspires you to keep going? Well, that initial spark won't do it, I know that much. What seemed like a great idea in my head, once it gets down on paper, you know, it's going to take more than just that one great idea to keep a story rolling. Sometimes I'm not even sure inspired is the right word for keeping going. That first idea does seem like inspiration, like a spark of something that comes from outside and lights up in my brain. But it really just feels like keeping at it and keeping at the work. I guess it's not so much inspiration at that point, it's fuel. It's what fuels the project, what gives me the faith and the energy to keep working at it when I'm no longer excited about this bright new idea and I'm maybe having doubts about how it's going. And for me, that is always the same answer. It's the characters. I have to feel deeply about my characters, and I have to be able to go back and read over scenes I've written and go, I love these people. I don't always like them maybe, but I love them and I care about what happens to them, and I have to write through the story, if only to find out what happens. Other than that, it's just the sheer slogging hard work of saying, I am going to sit down today and write another piece of this story. It isn't always easy, and I think if you look at my videos for the past year, you'll see there have definitely been times when I've fallen into that slump and had to climb back out of it and get writing again. But every time, pretty much, it's what I've already written about the characters or what's already in my head that's pulling me forward to find out more. I did get one other interesting question that kind of relates back to this idea of where you first get ideas from. And the question was, how much is it okay to borrow from or parallel the work of another author? And I think that's interesting because sometimes that inspiration thing that clicks into our head can be triggered by someone else's stories. Sometimes it's conscious and we're reading something and thinking, oh, it would be great to write a story like this, but to take it in this other direction. Sometimes it's unconscious. And this is when I think it's the most dangerous, when you have an idea that seems like a great idea and you get so far into it only to realize that somebody else has already had that great idea. Probably for for most of us, the most famous example of this would be the novel The Blue Castle by Ella Montgomery, beloved novel about a young woman who mistakenly is told that she has a terminal illness which will kill her in about a year. She decides to live that last year of her life to the full, runs off with a totally inappropriate man, and then of course discovers that, oh, it was a misdiagnosis, she's not going to die after all, but it turns out they've fallen in love, and that's a really brief recap. But the interesting thing is that that novel came out, a long time ago, early 20th century. Much more recently, a novel called The Ladies of Missolonghi came out. I mean, it's still a few decades ago now, but it's much more recent than Montgomery's novel. And very quickly after it hit the presses, despite being, written by a well-respected author and published by a fairly significant publishing house, nobody along the way seemed to have spotted what thousands of readers spotted immediately, was that this had basically the same plot as The Blue Castle. And the author's explanation for it finally was that maybe she had read or heard the plot of the Montgomery story many years ago, and it had lingered in her head, but she had not consciously tried to imitate it. And I think that's a really tricky and dangerous thing, because there really are only so many storylines in the world. If you're going to write a story about a man and a woman who fall in love, but along the way they encounter some obstacles that drive them apart and they overcome it and end up together, yeah, I don't think you need to worry too much about borrowing someone else's plot, because that is one of the plots in the world. When the specifics of your story start to parallel too closely the specifics of someone else's story, you do have to kind of pull back and say, yeah, what am I doing here that's really original? What am I bringing to this that another author hasn't previously done? So that's something that you do have to think about, and it's something that I think about. I even think about imitating myself too much and using too many of the same tropes and ideas, particularly if I'm writing in the same historical period. Next week is my 52nd show, which is pretty much a year since I started doing this, give or take a couple of weeks that I missed, but I missed very little along the way. Started in October, I've reached show 52 in October, and next week I'm going to talk about where I'm at with this project, both the videos and the book, and where I go from here.